The hegemony of acoustically superior species had, in their infinite wisdom and insufferable arrogance, decided that the universe needed a soundtrack. More specifically, they had decreed that only certain species possessed the refined auditory capabilities necessary to contribute to what they pompously called the galactic harmonic consciousness. It was, as these things typically are, exactly as pretentious as it sounds. The HFY headquarters orbited the crystalline world of Euphonia Prime, a planet so acoustically perfect that even a whisper could travel across continents with crystal clarity. The structure itself was a monument to musical snobbery, a sprawling complex of resonance chambers and harmonic amplifiers that looked like someone had crossbred a cathedral with a tuning fork and given it delusions of grandeur. Every surface was designed to enhance sound quality, from the polished metamorphic walls that eliminated unwanted frequencies to the gravity-defying spires that served as natural sound conductors. Inside this temple to tonal tyranny, the annual Galactic Cultural Exchange was reaching its crescendo of cultural condescension. Representatives from across the known galaxy had gathered to demonstrate their species' musical prowess, each performance serving as both entertainment and political posturing. The unspoken rule was simple: the more complex your natural harmonics, the higher your civilization ranked in the galactic pecking order. The Vorthak delegation had opened the proceedings with their trademark 12-part throat singing, each of their elongated necks producing a different frequency that combined into harmonies so mathematically precise they could calculate pi to the 1000th decimal. Polite applause rippled through the amphitheater, though everyone knew this was merely the opening act. Next came the Zenithari, whose crystalline bodies resonated with environmental frequencies, turning them into living instruments. Their performance was less music and more acoustic architecture. They literally sang buildings into existence, their voices shaping matter at the molecular level. The audience nodded approvingly. Now this was what passed for musical sophistication in civilized society. The Pulsarians followed with their electromagnetic symphonies, broadcast directly into the neural pathways of their listeners. No crude sound waves for these beings. They composed pure thought music that bypassed the ears entirely and painted emotions directly onto consciousness. Several ambassadors wept, though whether from genuine emotion or political necessity remained unclear. Throughout these displays of auditory supremacy, one particular human sat in the designated developing species section, watching the proceedings with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had long since accepted that their opinion mattered about as much as a sneeze in a hurricane. Ambassador Hadley Chen, no relation to any of the usual suspects that seemed to populate every other human story, had been Earth's representative to the Galactic Music Council for 3 years, 3 months, and roughly 17 accumulated lifetimes of diplomatic frustration. The human had learned through painful experience that enthusiasm was not appreciated in these circles. Early in his tenure he had made the mistake of actually enjoying some of the performances, only to be informed by a helpful Vorthak that his primitive neural architecture was incapable of truly appreciating the mathematical elegance of proper music. Apparently the fact that humans required their music to have something as crude as rhythm was evidence of their evolutionary inadequacy. As the performances continued, the commentary from the audience grew increasingly pointed. The harmonious High Chancellor of the Zenithari delegation leaned toward his aide, his crystalline form chiming softly with each word. "I do hope the humans aren't planning another of their presentations this year. Last time's cacophony still gives me structural resonance nightmare." The aide's response was barely audible but carried clearly in the acoustically perfect chamber. "I believe they call it jazz, your resonance. Something about improvisation and emotional expression." "How wonderfully primitive," the Chancellor replied, his tone suggesting that he found the concept about as appealing as rust on his crystalline skin. From the Pulsarian section came the electromagnetic equivalent of snickering, emotional expression through sound waves. Imagine being so evolutionarily stunted that you can't simply transmit feelings directly. It's like watching a species trying to paint with mud when they could be sculpting with pure light. Ambassador Chen continued to maintain his diplomatic composure, though his fingers drummed silently against his knee in a rhythm that would have been immediately recognizable to any human as the opening of Beethoven's Fifths. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a galaxy full of species who could literally reshape matter with their voices or transmit pure emotion through electromagnetic pulses, humans were considered the musical primitives because they preferred their songs to have what the sophisticated races dismissed as pedestrian temporal patterns. The climactic moment arrived when symphonic overlord Crescendo of the Haas Central Authority took the stage. The being was less creature and more living sound system, a shifting mass of acoustic perfection that existed simultaneously in 17 dimensions, each one contributing to a harmonic complexity that made previous performances seem like children's lullabies by comparison. Crescendo's song wasn't heard so much as experienced on a cellular level. It was mathematics made audible, physics transformed into poetry, the fundamental frequencies of reality itself, arranged into patterns so perfect they bordered on religious experience. The performance lasted exactly 4.7 minutes, and contained roughly the same amount of artistic complexity as the entire human musical catalogue, or so the being would later claim. As the final notes faded into the acoustically perfect silence of the chamber, Crescendo's attention turned toward the human section with the sort of benevolent condescension typically reserved for particularly slow children. And now, the overlord announced, his voice carrying harmonics that made the walls themselves sing in sympathy. Perhaps our developing friends from Earth would care to share an example of their musical tradition. The emphasis on musical suggested that Crescendo was being extraordinarily generous with his terminology. Around the amphitheater, beings who could compose symphonies with their digestive systems turned expectant attention toward the lone human representative. Ambassador Chen rose slowly, acutely aware that he was about to commit what would either be a diplomatic breakthrough or career suicide. From his portable sound system, a device so primitive by galactic standards that it might as well have been two rocks being struck together, he began to play a simple recording. The opening notes of an old Earth ballad filled the chamber, causing immediate confusion among the assembled musical elite. Where were the mathematical progressions, the dimensional harmonics, the consciousness-expanding frequency modulations? This was just melody. Simple, straightforward, and utterly incomprehensible to beings who had evolved past such rudimentary concepts as songs you could hum. Fascinating, Crescendo mused, his tone suggesting he found it anything but a single melodic line with basic rhythmic accompaniment. I assume this is an example of your species' earliest musical attempts, before you developed proper compositional theory. Actually, Chen replied with the sort of smile that should have been a warning sign. This was written about 200 years ago. It's considered one of our more sophisticated pieces. The silence that followed was so profound that even in the acoustically perfect chamber, you could have heard a pin drop, if pins dropping were considered musically relevant, which they decidedly were not. And that's when symphonic overlord Crescendo made the announcement that would change the course of galactic history. I hereby declare that the species of Earth, having demonstrated a fundamental inability to grasp even basic musical principles, is banned from participation in the Galactic Music Council until such time as they evolve beyond their current acoustic limitations. The decision was unanimous, of course. After all, who were they to argue with such obvious musical superiority? Ambassador Chen nodded politely, gathered his primitive sound equipment, and prepared to return to Earth with news that would, in ways no one in that chamber could possibly imagine, be exactly what humanity had been waiting to hear. Ambassador Chen's return to Earth was met with exactly the sort of reaction one might expect when informing an entire species that they had been deemed musically incompetent by beings who considered themselves the universe's premier arbiters of artistic sophistication. Which is to say, humanity took the news with all the grace and dignity of a punk rock concert in a library. The United Earth Cultural Council convened an emergency session within hours of Chen's report, though convened might be generous terminology for what was essentially several hundred of Earth's brightest minds, sitting in a room and collectively deciding that the galaxy's musical elite could, in the most diplomatic terms possible, go harmonize with themselves. Let me understand this correctly, said Director Anya Volkov, her Russian accent adding an extra layer of incredulity to words that were already dripping with disbelief. These have declared our entire musical heritage primitive because we use rhythm and melody instead of dimensional frequency manipulation. That's a gross oversimplification, Chen replied, though his tone suggested he found the oversimplification refreshingly accurate. They also objected to our tendency to express emotion through musical composition, which they consider evolutionarily regressive. The council chamber erupted in what could generously be called discussion, and more accurately described as the sort of indignant babble that occurs when several hundred creative types realize they've been collectively insulted by entities who think art should require a mathematics degree to appreciate. Dr. Elena Blackstone. Wait, scratch that. Dr. Elena was unfortunately on the forbidden names list. Beatrice Hartwell, Earth's leading expert in xenological psychology, leaned forward with the expression of someone who had just discovered something delightfully terrible. Did they provide any scientific basis for this assessment, or are we operating purely on musical snobbery here? Oh, they had charts, Chen replied with the sort of bitter amusement that comes from watching your life's work get dismissed by a pie graph. Apparently there's a direct correlation between acoustic sophistication and civilizational advancement. The more mathematically complex your species' natural harmonics, the more politically relevant you become. How wonderfully logical, muttered Dr. Felix Nakamura from the Anthropological Music Studies Department. I suppose it never occurred to these acoustic overlords that maybe, just maybe, the point of music isn't to demonstrate how many dimensions you can warble in simultaneously. The comments sparked something that could charitably be called brainstorming, and more accurately described as the moment when humanity's collective creative consciousness decided to prove a point that would echo across star systems. Because if there's one thing humans excel at, it's taking perceived limitations and weaponizing them into strengths that no one saw coming. Within weeks, what started as diplomatic frustration had evolved into the most ambitious cultural project in human history. Universities, conservatories, garage bands, street musicians and bedroom producers found themselves united in a common cause, proving that Earth's primitive approach to music was actually the galaxy's best-kept secret. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Amit Gupta's neurology lab at the Geneva Institute, where researchers had been studying the effects of music on human brain chemistry. What they discovered would have been revolutionary under normal circumstances. Given the current situation, it was nothing short of cosmic vindication. The aliens aren't wrong about our music being primitive, Dr. Gupta explained to the hastily assembled crowd of scientists, musicians and government officials, but they've fundamentally misunderstood what that primitiveness represents. While other species evolved past their emotional responses to auditory stimuli, humans retained the neurological pathways that connect sound directly to feeling. He gestured toward brain scans displayed on the wall, each one lighting up like a Christmas tree in response to different musical stimuli. Every other sentient species we've encountered has developed some form of auditory processing that filters out emotional response in favor of analytical appreciation. They can appreciate the mathematical beauty of a 17-dimensional harmonic progression, but they've lost the ability to feel what music is supposed to do. The implications hit the room like a particularly well-timed bass drop. If humans were the only species in the galaxy that retained the connection between sound and emotion, then Earth's primitive music wasn't a weakness, it was a superpower that nobody else possessed. Director Volkov was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Are you suggesting that our music could actually affect alien psychology? I'm suggesting, Dr. Gupta replied with the sort of smile that should have come with a warning label, that every other species in the galaxy has essentially performed advanced emotional lobotomies on themselves in pursuit of acoustic perfection. They've become so sophisticated that they've forgotten how to feel what they're hearing. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Somewhere in the galaxy, beings who could literally sing matter into existence and transmit pure thought through electromagnetic pulses had declared humans too primitive to participate in their cultural hierarchy. Meanwhile, humans had stumbled onto the one thing none of those advanced civilizations possessed: the ability to make music that could bypass logic and speak directly to the soul. What followed was 3 months of the most intensive musical research and development project in human history. Composers, neuroscientists, psychologists, and engineers worked around the clock to understand exactly how human music affected non-human psychology. The results were, in the words of one particularly excited researcher, absolutely diabolical. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implication. If the galactic musical elite wanted to dismiss human music as primitive noise, then humanity would show them exactly what primitive noise could accomplish when wielded by a species that actually understood what music was supposed to do. Phase 1 would begin during the next galactic cultural exchange,
when the entire HFY leadership would be gathered in one acoustically perfect location, completely unprepared for what Earth's musically challenged species was about to unleash upon their supposedly superior sensibility.
The grand convergence of harmonic excellence happened every 5 galactic standard years, and this particular iteration was shaping up to be the most pompously self-congratulatory event in the history of organized pretension. Representatives from every musically advanced civilization had gathered Euphonia Prime for what the HFY leadership had grandly declared a celebration of acoustic evolution, which was really just a fancy way of saying they planned to spend 3 days patting themselves on their various appendages for being so wonderfully sophisticated. What they didn't know was that Earth had spent the better part of 6 months preparing the galaxy's first and hopefully last example of weaponized emotional resonance. The plan was so audaciously simple that it bordered on poetry during the opening ceremony's moment of perfect galactic silence, a 5-minute period where all attending species would demonstrate their mastery over primitive sound-making by creating absolutely nothing. Humanity would fill that silence with something no advanced civilization had heard in millennia. Pure, unfiltered, emotionally devastating music. The technical challenges had been staggering. Smuggling broadcast equipment into the most acoustically monitored location in the galaxy required the sort of creative engineering typically reserved for heist movies. Earth's finest had developed what they cheerfully called audio viruses, self-replicating sound patterns that could hijack any acoustic system and turn it into a delivery mechanism for humanity's musical payload. Ambassador Chen, once again representing Earth in the developing species section, carried with him what appeared to be a standard diplomatic recording device. In reality, it was the most sophisticated piece of psychological warfare ever conceived by a species that supposedly couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. The device contained what Earth's musicians had dubbed the Humanity Suite, a carefully crafted 15-minute composition that combined every emotional manipulation technique ever discovered by human artists. It opened with the gentle melancholy of a lone violin, the kind of simple melody that the Zenithari had once dismissed as monophonic inadequacy. But this particular melody had been designed by teams of neuroscientists and composers working together, each note precisely calculated to trigger dormant emotional pathways in alien neural architecture. As the grand convergence began, symphonic overlord Crescendo took center stage with all the fanfare of a being who considered himself the physical embodiment of acoustic perfection. His opening address was a masterpiece of condescending eloquence, praising the assembled civilizations for their collective evolution beyond the crude emotional responses that plagued primitive species. Today, Crescendo announced, his 17-dimensional voice creating harmonics that made reality itself hum in appreciation. We celebrate not just our musical achievements but our transcendence of the base instincts that once tied consciousness to mere feeling. We have evolved beyond the need for music to move us. Instead, we move music itself, bending sound to our intellectual will rather than surrendering our minds to auditory chaos. The assembled delegates applauded with mathematical precision, each species contributing their own acoustically perfect expression of approval. It was, even by the standards of galactic pomposity, an impressively pretentious moment, which made what happened next all the more beautiful. Chen activated his device during the ceremonial moment of perfect galactic silence, and the first notes of humanity's musical ambush began to spread through Euphonia Prime's flawless acoustic system. The opening violin melody seemed almost apologetic as it filled the chamber, so simple, so primitive, so utterly beneath the notice of beings who could compose symphonies with their digestive processes. Then the guitar joined in, not the mathematical precision of crystalline resonance, or the calculated complexity of electromatic harmonics, but the raw, unfiltered expression of a species that had never learned to separate thinking from feeling. The melody built slowly, joined by drums that provided the sort of rhythmic foundation that advanced civilizations had dismissed as temporal crudity. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Vorthak delegation was the first to show symptoms. Their usually perfect 12-part throat singing began to waver as unfamiliar sensations started coursing through their elongated necks. For the first time in evolutionary ages, they were feeling the music instead of simply analyzing it. The Zenithari were next. Their crystalline forms designed for acoustic perfection became unwitting amplifiers for human emotional expression. As the music washed over them, their bodies began resonating not with calculated frequencies but with something far more dangerous: spontaneous response to beauty. Several delegates began to glow with colors they hadn't produced since their species' prehistoric period. But it was the Pulsarians who provided the most spectacular demonstration of humanity's musical warfare. Beings who transmitted pure thought found themselves overwhelmed by the revolutionary concept of music that didn't require conscious interpretation. Their electromagnetic fields began fluctuating wildly as they experienced the alien sensation of being moved by something they couldn't intellectually control. As the music built toward its crescendo, chaos erupted throughout the chamber. The harmonious High Chancellor of the Zenithari was discovered weeping, actually weeping in a corner, his crystalline form chiming with what could only be described as grief for beauty he'd never known he'd lost. Pulsarian delegates were broadcasting raw emotional data across their entire communication network, accidentally transmitting the experience of feeling music to their entire civilization. Even the mighty Vorthak were reduced to something resembling humanity, their perfect mathematical harmonies dissolving into what could only be called singing, the sort of joyful, uncontrolled expression they hadn't experienced since their species learned to calculate optimal vocal arrangement. At the center of it all, symphonic overlord Crescendo stood frozen in what appeared to be the galaxy's first case of aesthetic shock. The being who had spent eons perfecting the intellectual appreciation of sound was experiencing the terrifying revelation that music was supposed to make you feel things raw, unfiltered, completely illogical things that had nothing to do with mathematical elegance and everything to do with being alive. The music reached its climax with a full orchestral arrangement that combined every emotional manipulation technique Earth had ever developed. By the time it ended, the most acoustically sophisticated gathering in galactic history had been reduced to a collection of beings discovering what it meant to be moved by beauty instead of impressed by complexity. In the aftermath, as delegates from across the galaxy sat in stunned silence trying to process sensations their species had evolved past millennia ago, Ambassador Chen stood quietly in the developing species section with a smile that suggested humanity had just proven a very important point about the difference between sophistication and soul. The Galactic Music Council would never be the same. More importantly, neither would anyone who had experienced what happened when a supposedly primitive species decided to show the galaxy what music was actually supposed to do. 6 months after what historians would eventually record as the Great Emotional Awakening, though humans privately called it the day we broke the galaxy's brain, the universe had developed a distinctly different soundtrack. The change wasn't subtle. Entire star systems that had once hummed with mathematically perfect harmonies now echoed with something far more chaotic and infinitely more alive. Euphonia Prime, that former bastion of acoustic superiority, had become an unlikely pilgrimage. Where once the crystalline spires had resonated with calculated perfection, they now rang with the sounds of confused aliens attempting to understand concepts their species had forgotten before humans had discovered fire. The planet's perfect acoustic chambers, designed to eliminate unwanted emotional interference, had been hastily retrofitted with what the AHS leadership euphemistically called primitive response enhancement systems, which was just a fancy way of saying they'd installed speakers. The hegemony of acoustically superior species had undergone what could charitably be called a complete organizational restructuring, though catastrophic identity crisis might be more accurate. Their headquarters now resembled less a temple to tonal perfection, and more a rehabilitation center for beings discovering they had feeling. Former symphonic overlord Crescendo had been demoted to emotional integration specialist, a position that mostly involved sitting in circles with other formerly superior beings, trying to understand why certain combinations of sound made them want to cry. "I don't comprehend it," Crescendo confessed during one particularly painful session, his 17-dimensional voice now reduced to what could only be described as a whimper. "For eons we perfected the mathematical relationships between frequency and consciousness. We eliminated the chaos of emotional response. We achieved acoustic purity. And now I find myself moved by the sound of humans banging on stretched animal skin in temporal pattern." His therapist, a human naturally, since Earth had cornered the market on beings who understood the connection between sound and feeling, nodded sympathetically. Grace Pemberton had left a promising career in music therapy, to become the galaxy's first interspecies emotional rehabilitation specialist, a job title that would have sounded ridiculous 6 months ago,
and now commanded a salary that made her question why she'd ever doubted the power of a good melody. "It's perfectly normal," she assured the former overlord. "Your species spent millennia training yourselves not to feel music. It's going to take time to remember how to let it affect you." Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out with the sort of cosmic irony that suggested the universe had a sense of humor after all. The Vorthak, who had once prided themselves on their mathematical throat singing, now attended human-run workshops with names like Feeling Your Frequencies and Emotional Expression Through Vocal Vibration. Their perfect 12-part harmonies had given way to something far more chaotic but infinitely more satisfying. They were learning to sing because they wanted to, not because they could calculate the optimal acoustic outcome. The Zenithari faced perhaps the most dramatic adjustment. Their crystalline bodies, evolved for acoustic perfection, had become unwilling amplifiers for every emotional nuance in human music. A single listening session with Earth's jazz collection had resulted in what their medical specialists termed chromatic emotional overflow. Their bodies literally couldn't stop changing colors in response to the feelings the music evoked. Several delegates had required emergency treatment after exposure to particularly moving blues arrangements. Most amusing were the Pulsarians, whose electromagnetic communication networks had become inadvertent broadcasting systems for human music. Their entire civilization was now experiencing what they called involuntary emotional transmission syndrome. Basically, they couldn't stop accidentally sharing feelings through their neural networks. The species that had once transmitted pure thought found themselves broadcasting the musical equivalent of emotional chaos every time someone played a particularly moving human song. Earth, meanwhile, had become the unlikely cultural capital of the galaxy. The same planet whose musical contributions had been dismissed as primitive noisemaking now hosted embassies from every major civilization, each one desperately trying to understand how humans had mastered something that apparently no other species possessed. The Galactic Music Council had been disbanded, replaced by the Interspecies Emotional Expression Academy, a fancy name for an institution where humans taught aliens how to feel things again. The irony was so profound it could have been set to music, and in fact several human composers had done exactly that. Ambassador Chen, now bearing the title Director of Galactic Emotional Education, found himself in the peculiar position of explaining basic musical concepts to beings who could reshape reality with their voices. His office on Euphonia Prime overlooked the former Chamber of Acoustic Supremacy, now converted into something called the Earth Music Experience Center, where aliens paid substantial fees to have humans explain why certain sequences of sound made them want to dance. The tragedy, Chen reflected during one of his regular reports to Earth, isn't that they considered our music primitive. The tragedy is that in their quest for acoustic perfection, they achieved exactly what they wanted, and lost everything that made music worth creating in the first place. The greatest irony came during the first anniversary of the Great Emotional Awakening, when the former Hayes leadership attempted to honor Earth with a special ceremony. They had composed what they called a mathematical tribute to primitive excellence, 17 minutes of precisely calculated harmonics, designed to express gratitude through acoustic perfection. It was, by all technical measures, flawless. It was also, by any meaningful standard, completely soulless. The humans in attendance listened politely, applauded diplomatically, and then, with the sort of gentle kindness typically reserved for children who had tried very hard to do something beyond their capability, suggested that perhaps the former overlords might benefit from a few more lessons in emotional expression. In the end, the galaxy had learned what humans had always known, that the point of music wasn't to demonstrate how clever you were, but to share what it felt like to be alive. The species that had mocked Earth's love for primitive rhythm and melody, now queued up by the millions to experience what they had lost in their relentless pursuit of acoustic superiority. And somewhere in the acoustically perfect chambers of Euphonia Prime, the universe's new soundtrack played on, a little rough around the edges, occasionally off-key, but alive with the sort of beautiful imperfection that only came from beings who had never forgotten that music was supposed to move the soul, not just impress the mind.